Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Wow. I didn't even say anything. It's so great to see you all. Thank you for being here. My name is Marcia Eli. I am absolutely thrilled to greet you on behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library, our Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents, and the Center for Brooklyn History of the Brooklyn Public Library. Isaac Butler's recent book, The Method, How the 20th Century Learned to Act, tells the story, the saga really, of method acting's journey from its roots in Russia to the group theater in New York to Hollywood. Winner of the 2022 National Book Critics Award in Nonfiction, it was named one of the best books of the year by The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Time Magazine, Vox, and many others. The New York Times called it, this is my favorite, compulsively readable. And that maybe says something about me. But we're really very excited to have Isaac with us tonight, along with his amazing conversation partner, Zoe Kazan, to talk about method acting and the book, which I'm happy to share was just released in paperback. You can applaud that. Yeah. So before I introduce them more formally, I want to let you know that towards the end of the conversation, you'll have a chance to ask questions, and as you came in or once you were here, you were given an index card and a pencil. If you write questions on those, a little bit in, the ushers will come and hold up a card, and you can pass your questions down to the end, and then we'll bring them up here, and we'll have your questions answered. I also want to make sure that you saw the new paperback edition of The Method at the CBH shop as you came in. And following the program, Isaac will be happy to sign copies and continue the conversation informally. So now I'm delighted to tell you just a bit more about these two extraordinary culture makers and invite them to the stage. Isaac Butler is the co-author with Dan Kois of The World Only Spins Forward, The Ascent of Angels in America, which NPR named one of the best books of 2018, and as you know, The Method. His writing has appeared in New York Magazine, Slate, The Guardian, American Theater, and a bunch of other publications. His work as a director has been seen on stages throughout the U.S. He teaches theater history and performance at the New School and elsewhere. Zoe Kazan is the granddaughter of Elia Kazan, who co-founded the Actors Studio, which really largely introduced method acting to the States. She made her acting debut in 2003 in the film Sword Swallowers and Thin Men, and between then and now there have been The Savages, Revolutionary Road, It's Complicated, Olive Kitteridge, the HBO series for which she received an Emmy nomination, The Big Sick, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, several Broadway productions, the writing of Ruby Sparks and Wildlife, which she co-wrote with Paul Dano, the HBO miniseries The Plot Against America, Clickbait on Netflix, and portraying New York Times reporter Jodi Kantor in She Said. And recently announced, Zoe has joined the Broadway cast of Doubt, and previews for that begin in February. So, we're excited and to hear what they have to say, and really honored and thrilled that they are here. And so please help me welcome them to the stage.
Hey everyone, hello, whoa, hey, hello. How's it going? Good to see you all. This is wow, this is a lot of people. It's like raining and cold out. You could be home watching Call My Agent, and instead you are here, and for that I am eternally grateful. Thank you so much to the Center for Brooklyn History for having us. You know, they just reopened in September, and so we're very happy to be part of their sort of first fall slate. I'm going to read a little bit from the book. If you like this part, there's 400 more pages that are almost as good. And then afterwards, Zoe and I are going to talk a bit, and then we'll take some questions and sign some books. And oh my God, my family's right there. Okay, and all sorts of things like that. So without further ado, so I'm going to read a little bit about the group theater. The only thing you really need to know here is that a lot of this section is about Clifford Odets, who would go on to be sort of the most important leftist writer of the 30s. And this is sort of about that, but at the time he was like a frustrated, out of work actor who couldn't get a date and didn't feel like anyone respected him. All right. Clifford Odets was growing disillusioned with the group, and he told Harold Clurman he was quitting. Harold tried to persuade him to stay. Clifford told him he'd never had a decent role and had never been taken seriously. No vision of America's new theatrical hope could justify throwing away his prime years playing crap walk-on parts. Just wait, Clurman implored him. A good part will come for you later this year. You're behind time, Harold, Odets responded. He didn't even think of himself as an actor anymore. He was a writer. Ever since audiences greeted I Got the Blues' second act warmly a few years earlier, he had kept working away at it, and he was also drafting a new play, which would be called Paradise Lost. He was sick of the group never producing his work. Harold again begged him to stay, and Odets finally relented. Odets needed to feel important, but he could not foresee how important he was about to become. The company toured Boston, and Clifford told Clurman he yearned to belong to the largest possible group of humble, struggling men. His hunger took him to union meetings and Faneuil Hall, where he watched the fiery oratory of Joe Kelleher, a union organizer trying to persuade boat workers to strike. Odets struck up a friendship with Kelleher, who told him he needed a play they could put on at meetings. After a failed attempt to collaboratively write the play with some of his group mates, Odets sat down, inspired by a recent taxi driver strike, to write the play himself. 3 days later, he stood up, clutching the pages of a new work titled Waiting for Lefty. Its opening cantankerous jumble of lines announcing the arrival of a new American voice. You're so wrong, I ain't laughing. Any guy with eyes to read knows it. Look at the textile strike, out like lions and in like lambs. Take the San Francisco tie-ups, starvation and broken heads. That voice, Odets' voice, is slang drunk, slinging street elocutions with such density and fire that they become poetry. It's the sound of New York in the 1930s, the sound of polyglot immigrant tongues wrapping their rhythms around an English language that is stretching to accommodate them. This voice, which echoes throughout his plays, both great, Waiting for Lefty, Awake and Sing, Paradise Lost, Golden Boy, and not so great, all the others, is urban, Jewish, neurotic, furious, explosive, and full of yearning. In Lefty, that yearning is for a better, fairer America to rise from the ashes of the Depression. The nation's economic calamity was particularly visible in the New York City where Odets lived and wrote. Hoovervilles, the impromptu shanty towns made up of thousands of newly homeless evictees, covered almost every stretch of available land. Up until 1933, the Tammany machine pocketed most of the relief money coming from the state and gave the rest to its cronies. In 1934, the year that the group premiered Gold Eagle Guy, so many people were living in Central Park's sheep meadow that the state evacuated the sheep out of fear that they would be slaughtered and eaten. Beginning with a meeting of cab drivers contemplating a strike, Waiting for Lefty breaks out into a series of vignettes, taking us everywhere from the bedroom to a laboratory where scientists argue the ethics of making poison gas. In its 7 short scenes, Odets dramatizes a world in which all human relations are shaped and degraded by capitalism. Wives leave husbands for richer men. Brother betrays brother by spying on the labor movement. A gifted young doctor is first to be laid off from a hospital because he's Jewish. One by one, they dream of a better tomorrow. Must they go to the Soviet Union? Or can that better world be found here in the United States? Waiting for Lefty chooses the second answer, of course. It's a deliberate piece of agitprop written for a left-wing political benefit. There's a scene in which an out-of-work actor is given a copy of the Communist Manifesto by a producer's secretary who reassures him that the meek shall not inherit the earth, but the militants will. Subtle? It is not. Konstantin Stanislavski would have recoiled from its overt politics, but by the time a cab driver named Isaac Keller cries out, "Hello, America, hello! We are the storm birds of the working class, workers of the world, our bones and blood," and exhorts the audience to strike, Odets's convictions and the ramshackle beauty of his writing prove irresistible. Odets wrote Lefty so that it could be rehearsed and produced anywhere. The set was a semicircle of chairs. The actors sat on the chairs, and when their vignette came around, they popped up and into the scene, only to sit down when it was over. Most scenes called for only 2 or 3 people. Clifford and Sandy Meisner directed the play, working with actors in their dressing rooms while Gold Eagle Guy performed. The actors loved it. "Harold," Luther Adler said, "the group has produced the finest revolutionary playwright in America." But Lefty was never performed in Boston. Half-staged, unrealized, the play went back in the drawer while Gold Eagle Guy shambled on. Odets's discontent only grew, as did everyone else's. One night, Odets told Clerman that the group was beginning to lose faith in him. They'd all been working together for 4 years, and Harold had still refused to direct. Clerman talked a good game, but he needed to prove himself with a production. That's what leaders of companies did. "That may be," Clerman responded, "but he wasn't going to direct any old play that came around. The time had to be right, as did the script." Months later, New Theater, a leftist magazine, needed entertainment for an upcoming benefit. Waiting for Lefty came out of the drawer, and the cast began working on it again. "We rehearsed Lefty without the supervision of an overlord," Elia Kazan recalled. "The performance was less directed than played. Over the years in our acting classes, we'd all done scores of scenes like the ones Clifford had written. Still, they invited Lee Strasberg to a rehearsal. He gazed upon their run-through like a remote father observing the games of his recalcitrant children. When Odets asked him what he thought of the show, Strasberg shrugged. He felt the whole enterprise was a mistake, and he privately told Harold Clerman, 'Let them fall and break their necks.'" Waiting for Lefty premiered at Civic Rep on January 6, 1935. It was, from the very first scene, a quiver of thunderbolts hurled one by one at the crowd. Here was real life, the life of the working class given dramatic form and urgency and a kind of grace by Odets's marvelous ear. The audience laughed, they cheered, they leaned forward in their seats. Audience and actor had become one, Harold Clerman remembered. Line after line brought applause, whistles, bravos, and heartfelt shouts of kinship. And then, something remarkable happened. As Isaac Keller, played by Joe Bromberg, began his stem winder about the storm birds of the working class, an energy started to build in the room. When he asked, "Well, what's the answer?" and a few plants in the audience shouted, "Strike," the rest of the audience shouted right along with them. "Strike! Strike! 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 Strike!" The audience leapt to its feet, applauding, screaming, nearly delirious. Out of their throats came what Harold Clerman would call the birth cry of the 30s. Our youth had found its voice. Waiting for Lefty was a call to action, a play that believed that the struggle for a better world was worth dedicating your life to and worth dying for. The readership of New Theater wholeheartedly agreed. "I was terrified the balcony was going to fall in," Ruth Nelson said. "I remember the sense of wood in the theater, the sound of wood. We lined up at the curtain with Clifford because he, of course, was in the play, and the curtain went up and down and up and down and up and down, and every one of us was crying like a baby." The audience, too bewitched to go home, hung around, talking. A few wandered the stage, spellbound by what they'd seen. And the actors? "We couldn't sleep that night," Kazan said. "We struggled north through the silent streets, Harold Clerman among us. We found a child's that was open all night and lingered over our suppers, not talking too much, stunned by what had occurred. None of us was ever to be the same again, and I suppose we all knew it." Thank you. Thank you so much. Yep. Zoe Kazan, ladies and gentlemen.
Everybody. I'm just checking everybody's sight lines. If you cannot see Isaac, please move so you can see him.
Or I could do like a 3/4 squat.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Isaac and I are friends. Hi. I have broken down my questions into 3 parts.
That's great, like the book. It's
Just like the book. And I want to talk first about writing the book, then we'll go into the contents of the book, and then I want to talk a little bit about like what you have taken away from writing this book. I know that you studied acting and directing and stuff before this, but what did you learn from your research about the process of acting that helped you in your process of writing this book?
Oh, wow. Everything in a weird way. I mean, I went to grad school for writing too, so it's like I thought I knew how to do this. This is my second book, but I didn't, it turns out. The first third of the book is about Konstantin Stanislavski and about him trying to figure out how an actor can be inspired on demand, right? How can you actually have artistic inspiration on demand? And he comes up with all these other things on the way of trying to figure that out. And one of them is this system of how to analyze a script and break it down into things like its unit of action. What causes what to happen? You lay those things out in a line, and you have the spine of the script or the line of action. What does every character want? Every character has to want something, and the thing that they want has to motivate what they do, and it's all about action and what the world of the play is like, which is called the given circumstances and all this other stuff. And I just lifted that wholesale. I mean, like every time I read about some breakthrough he had about how to rehearse a play or how a play is constructed, I'm like, oh yeah, that works for writing too, actually. So, one example is the book takes place over 100 years. Its main character is an idea, not a person. And so like structure was really hard to figure out. And one of the things that Stanislavski's always talking about is this Russian term called the zadachha. I'm sure I'm butchering that. But the zadachha means both task and problem. It means both those things simultaneously. It doesn't really quite translate. And so I started thinking about like, oh, I need to figure out where the problems are. Like I need to organize it by going from problem to problem, like you would in a play. And I had a really big breakthrough that actually the person who helped me with this breakthrough is actually here, Catherine Nichols over there. Yeah, applaud for Catherine, that's great. I had written, I guess it's like the third chapter of the book, Moscow Art Theater gets founded, everything is great. Within 5 years, the two people who found the Moscow Art Theater aren't speaking to one another. Their star playwright, Anton Chekhov, is dead. There's a failed revolution in Moscow. Like a lot of shit's going on. And my third chapter originally began with a very long, and I'm guessing tedious, tour through all these things that happened over the past 5 years. And Catherine very wisely was like, you need to just start with what the problem is. Like the problem is Stanislavski going up on his lines and this production and everything. I was like, yes, the problem, of course. He's written all this stuff about problems. I should just do problems. So if you know that and read the book, you'll see that like every chapter, it's like, what's the big problem these people have to go through? And it just sort of jumps in time to get to each one of those. So all that stuff was really, really helpful.
That's so cool. That kind of leads me to, I had a thought about halfway through the book about, there's a kind of struggle that you delineate here between methods of teaching the method of acting, and one sort of prizes action the way that you're talking about, and one prizes the emotional experience of the actor, or the actor's ability to produce emotion. And so I'm sort of wondering how you balance those two things, the action of the book, the thing that you're talking about, the problems in the kind of like emotional life of the book. And like on that, I guess, I know that you are an avid reader of novels, and also that you have this experience as a dramatist. And I'm sort of curious how, in talking about the emotional life of the book, like how you brought your novelistic brain to bear, your dramatist's brain to bear.
Yeah, I mean, I had to restrain it to a certain extent because you can't make anything up, and I really firmly believe that. I remember I wrote some scene where, I started getting into the perhapsing, which any of you nonfiction writers in here will know, where you're like, well, perhaps this happened, or perhaps this happened. I was like, no, I can't do the perhapsing thing. That's a thing you do in graduate school. It's unprofessional. And I cut all that, and I made a new rule for myself and wrote it down, no perhapsing. But I got lucky in that all these people wrote letters and memoirs, a lot of memoirs, a lot of letters. The fact that Nemirovich and Stanislavski despised each other was actually great, because we have this voluminous correspondence, because after they were no longer on speaking terms, they worked together for 33 more years. They did not stop working together until Stanislavski died of his 17th heart attack. So, I got a lot of access to their interiority through that. So anytime in the book that it's like he thought this, it's because there's a place where he said, oh, I thought this. I wanted to be really, really rigorous about that. In terms of getting the balance between the interior and the exterior, those two rival camps you're talking about, Stella Adler being the much more action and imagination-driven one, and Lee Strasberg being the much more interior driven one. What Stella would always say is you can get to the interior from the action. What Lee would always say is you can get to the action from the interiority. There's sort of two routes to the same thing. But I found for myself that Adlerian thing of like, well, what is the action here? Okay, now that I know the action, well, what are the feelings that cause this to happen? Was really, really helpful. And also, like, it was a weirdly emotional experience to write. There's a lot of people who I grew to be very fond of who die. Everyone in this book is dead, and some very unfortunately. And really difficult stuff is going on in it. And at the same time, it was like really exciting to discover all of this stuff. And even though I don't appear in the book, I wanted the prose to have that feeling of like, hey, isn't this exciting? Or like, hey, isn't this kind of sad? Like that you're experiencing it while I'm experiencing it, hopefully.
Yeah, where was the germ of this book for you? Like, both from a inspiration standpoint and from the standpoint of like, where did you start your research? Where did you start your writing process?
The germ was, my editor said, do you have an idea for a next book? And I was like digging through things where I had written down ideas, and one of them was just the method, history, ? And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And he and I had lunch, and I had a few ideas, and he was like, I really like that method one, think about that one. And I went and researched it more, and I was like, you start out, at least I do, with, I have some questions. I like this idea. This history seems interesting. And then for me, because I come from a background of being an avid novel reader and everything like that, it's like, is there actually a good story here with these ideas? And very quickly I was like, every single person is a lunatic. Every single person in this story is bonkers. It's like a sack of baboons, And I was just sort of like, oh, great. Well, if everyone's bonkers, then it's going to be full of really dramatic stuff, I mean, all of these questions about what's the best way to create a character can seem very whatever, up in the clouds, but these were like life and death questions to these people. And I was like, well, if it's that important to them, I can make it that important to the reader, or at least the reader can understand, hey, this is why this is this important. So in terms of research, I just started chronologically. I to write the proposal for the book, I knew the thing that I knew the least about was Stanislavski. So the first thing I did was I got Jean Benedetti's biography of Stanislavski, which is it's wonderful. It's one of sort of 3 English language biographies of Stanislavski. And I read it and I was like, this guy is amazing. Like, his life is amazing. He's just consumed by these ideas. I kind of love him. I kind of despise him. This is great. He looks like Max von Sydow. It's great. And so I just slowly moved through it chronologically, basically. And then each of the 3 parts had a slightly different writing process. For part 1, I would research a chapter and then write it, and then research that. Once I knew the overview, and research the chapter and then write it. And then in part 2, which takes place over a shorter period of time, it really only takes place over a decade, and all the characters overlap more, I researched the whole thing and then wrote it. And then part 3 was entirely shaped by the pandemic. The pandemic broke out. I had finished part 2 and went out for lunch with a friend of mine to the now closed building on Bond, which closed a month later. And I was out at lunch with him, and I was like, oh, it seems like things are getting bad. And then my phone rang, and it was the school closing. And they were like, come get your kid, we're closing for the foreseeable future. And so everything was shaped by, we got to go out of town, we got to live with our parents, we got to get childcare, we got to do all this stuff. And so I sort of only vaguely remember that. The process. You and I were both writing and texting each other, being like, "Is the world going to end? Will there still be a world when our stuff comes out?" and everything like that. So yeah.
So one last question on the writing of the book, and then we'll move on. You're writing about embodied experience, and I'm curious about how you thought about the physical details of the book and how to impart that to the reader, because I mean, this goes to a larger question that I have, which I guess I'll just like crack into now, which is like, you describe Stanislavski as being almost like a physicist. And the thing that I really thought about was like, oh, that this is almost like writing about alchemists or something, like they're trying to make a science out of magic. And how do you write about the ineffable? So that's kind of like a two-pronged thing.
No, I really appreciate that. I mean, Stanislavski really struggled to write about this stuff. I mean, he was a bad writer. That's part of it. But but the things he's trying to write about
But it's not just Stanislavski. It's also sorry, go ahead.
No. I mean, what's one thing that keeps coming up in this story, it's almost like a running gag in the book that every time you get to the point where someone has to describe how any of this stuff works, they just make a total hash of it. I mean, Strasberg was a bad writer. Adler was a bad writer. Stanislavski was a bad writer. Bobby Lewis is the only one who's a good writer out of all of them because he's hilarious, right? He's at least cracking jokes. And I didn't want to fall into that trap. So, one thing I tried to do was just root it in, like, what are people actually doing, right? Like, and it's odd because you're describing a lot of stuff that they're talking about on the interior, but you can't see what's going on inside them, but you can describe what an actor's doing with their hands, right? Like, actors who were directed by Elia Kazan use their hands all the time because he was very famous for stage business. Whenever he didn't know he says this in his memoir and it became his reputation. When he was sort of lost with the play, he would just be like, I don't know, there's like lots of prop stuff to reveal subtext. He used props to reveal subtext all the time. So it's like, oh, well, look at that. What is he doing with his water bottle? What does that mean that he's doing that with his water bottle or whatever? And then, luckily, again, a lot of these memoirs and stuff had some physical detail in it. And then what they didn't have, I couldn't describe. Do you know what I mean? So, like, the group theater at one point goes to this retreat called Green Mansions in the Catskills. And it's, like, infested with mold. And it's damp. And you know what a humid New York summer is like, right? And you're in an unair-conditioned, dilapidated Catskills hotel. And it's, like, damp and moldy. And one of the characters thinks it's haunted. She keeps talking about, like, I think this is haunted. Like, are there ghosts here? Or like the barn that they rehearsed in for the first summer of the Moscow Art Theater, I happen to know was really hot, right? They talked about it. Like, it had a metal roof, right? And it was really hot, and they're going outside and smoking cigarettes. Like, I've done summer theater. I've been outside smoking cigarettes while it's really hot on the inside and you feel like you're dying. Like, I have some sense of what that's like,
That's great. There's a kind of, like, interesting double helix in the book that has to do with the financial or like the financial circumstances or statuses of these people. And one is a sort of strand of people who were born independently wealthy, like Stanislavski, and what their wealth allowed them to do. And one is like kind of not quite the opposite of that, but like people who come from immigrant families or who were immigrants themselves, people who come from like a very different kind of socioeconomic situation than that. And I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more about how those two things intertwine to create this revolution in acting.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I guess today we'd call it positionality, right? We'd be like, well, what's the position of this person in society and how does privilege work? And I didn't want to use those words because those weren't terms that they used, and I wanted to keep it kind of rooted in their consciousness as much as possible. But those are very real factors. Stanislavski was like a Rockefeller. Like contemporaries compared him to the Rockefellers. He was that rich. He ran his family were textile barons, and he ran his family's textile business factories while running the Moscow Art Theater and directing and acting in plays, which is bonkers. And then his partner, Nemirovich, was a self-made man. Self-made middle-class, man. And certainly some of their conflicts are rooted in that, because Stanislavski has a kind of like, oh, well, we'll just try this, and if we fail, we fail. Who gives a shit? I'll just make another thing. I'll spend another $1 million. And Nemirovich is like, this is my life, dude, and that's part of their fight, And then you get to the group theater, and, Harold Klerman wasn't independently wealthy. There were independently wealthy WASP members of the group, who, but Harold Klerman wasn't independently wealthy, but his dad was a doctor. He moved the family out of the Lower East Side into the Bronx, into a house. He paid for Harold to go to the Sorbonne when Harold had no idea what he wanted to do. They were like, well, your cousin Aaron Copland's going to study music. Why don't you, I know you don't know him that well, but maybe you guys could be roommates and you could find yourself in Paris. It's like, okay. Meanwhile, Lee Strasberg, immigrant, real name is Sroka. He's an immigrant. He's 2 years old when his family moves from the shtetl. His dad is a pants presser. He's a high school dropout. His older brother died of the Spanish flu, and he dropped out of high school, never had a formal education again after that, right? And these two men, their relationship and their friendship, off and on, shapes this entire thing. The group is entirely shaped by these kinds of dynamics because they're basically WASPs to the manner born, and children of immigrants from the shtetl. That's basically the whole group is just that. There's no middle ground, right? And it's one of many reasons why they just spend the entire decade arguing with one another. But it's a real and really powerful thing. And so I'm very interested in these ideas which come from human beings. They did not get plucked out of the cosmos. Like, who are these people and what shapes them? Another example is Stanislavski, very, very devout Russian Orthodox Christian. That's a part of his history that sort of got, during Stalin, they were like, let's not mention the devout Russian Orthodox Christian part, but he was actually a devout Russian Orthodox Christian. And then those ideas make their way over here, and they get adopted and adapted by Jews, right? Like, so something happens with the idea of like what the soul of a character is, because when Stanislavski says soul, he means the soul. He's like not being like, it's not a metaphor. He means an actual soul. What that means when a bunch of secular Jews take it up and start playing with those ideas. So I was always interested in how those factors intersect.
Yeah, I know that we talked about this beforehand, and I'm really curious about it, how you think that the secular Jewishness of so many of these theater artists had an impact on the development of the method.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you also see how their different attitudes towards it shape it. So like, I'll give you an example. Arthur Miller, right? Arthur Miller, who I maybe give short shrift in the book. He's not in it that much, but Arthur Miller is one of the key playwrights who's part of this revolution, right? It's Odets, Williams, Miller, and Inge are really the four big ones. If you read Death of a Salesman now, if you haven't read it, or if you can somehow give yourself amnesia and go back and read it again, it just seems very clear to me that it's about Jews, right? That it's about Jews trying to assimilate. Now, Arthur Miller would have been disgusted if you had told that to him. Do you know what I mean? But when I saw the recent African-American culturally specific production that was on Broadway, it suddenly was just blindingly clear to me. Oh, this is a play. These are Jewish characters. He's trying to assimilate. His kid's name is Biff and Happy, and he's like a football scholarship and all this stuff. And so, those dynamics are really, really shaping things. They're also shaping the ideas. Stella Adler is interested in research in a Talmudic way. I have read her script annotations. They read like the Midrash. I mean, for those of you who know what that is, I read one that was Zoo Story. She's teaching Zoo Story, the Edward Albee play, right? It's an hour long. It's a two-hander, classic of American acting training, right? She has blown it up, the pages in the Xerox thing, so that they have like 4 lines per page, right? And then on the back, she has this extensive annotation of each word these people are saying and what it could possibly mean. I mean, she's really like a rabbi trying to figure out, like what are you and are you not allowed to do after sundown on Friday night? Like she's really deep in it. Her dad was Jacob Adler, the world's most famous Yiddish theater actor, and the thing that he imparted to her as a kid is you got to go research. She was 9 years old playing the young Baruch Spinoza, as we all do when we're 9, in a play, and he was like, you have to go to the public library and read Spinoza when she was 9, and that's how she learned how to do what she did, right? And I think you also see it in their sort of draw to psychoanalysis, of course, which is another thing that brought on by secular Judaism. So I see it all over. I see it all over the place, but in much the same way that Jews were doing as we started assimilating. There's a lot of like hiding it as much as possible, but then it still comes out because it can't help but come out.
Yeah. So both in your Stanislavski section and in the later group theater section, you see the history of communism intertwined with the history of the method. And I'm curious what you think. I mean, you don't do a lot of like annotating about this in the book. Like, why do you think that is?
What I was really interested in was utopianism. And in both Russia and the United States, these are both utopian movements. Stanislavski was a utopianist. Suler, who's a big character in the first part of the book, who sort of helps figure out these ideas with Stanislavski and is the first person to teach them, is completely a utopianist. He's a Tolstoyan, he's a vegetarian, he travels the world helping dissidents settle in other countries. The group was absolutely a utopian community, and I just find utopianism really fascinating. In the first part of the book, the rise of communism absolutely shapes what's going on because their world is so tumultuous, and every now and then there's like a revolution or almost a revolution, and then the Moscow Art Theater has to get out of town and go on tour for a little while to avoid that revolution because like they're identified with the leftists, and the fascists might come kill them. And that's actually the reason why they start touring Europe and eventually the United States. If it weren't for the tumultuous political situation, like, we actually probably would not know much about the Moscow Art Theater over here. So, and then with the group, there's this weird thing of like, part of their utopianism is like half of them were communists, right? And then that has a huge effect in who gets to be famous, who doesn't get to be famous once we enter the McCarthy era and the time after that.
Yeah.
And so I just thought it was wild. It was wild to me that Nemirovich and Stanislavski have their first meeting just to get lunch, and then it's 18 hours long, an 18-hour-long lunch, during which they launch the idea of the Moscow Art Theater. And like a couple months later, the first meeting of what would become the Soviets is happening, right, to plan their revolution. And so like I was just like, wow, that's crazy that these things are happening at the same time,
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something that struck me. You use this phrase in the book a couple times about like what is a person?
Yeah.
And I think that there's
I still don't know, do you?
What?
Yeah.
But I do think that there's a kind of like, both of these movements are looking for that answer in a way,
Totally.
or like looking for a better way of life.
Totally. And what's also amazing to me is, the group was a collective organization. Half of them are communists, et cetera, and so forth. And what comes out of it, their utopian vision of acting, is the most individualistic acting theory ever designed, right?
Interesting.
I mean, Stella Adler's way of thinking about acting is way less is somewhat less individualistic. Meisner's is even less individualistic, but like Strasberg's is the most individualistic, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's just what is it? I mean, Stanislavski was not a communist, but had these collective ideals of how you work and of art making. And out of the group comes born, this thing that is all about the individual, and then it takes over Hollywood and America as we become a more individualistic society.
Totally. I think there's, it just seems so clear to me that the HUAC chapter of our American history is a tragedy. And I found it very painful to watch it unfold in your book. Part of what I find really painful about it is that it seems like it's just not that well taught in our schools. I know that the reason that I knew about what happened in HUAC was because of my own family's involvement.
Right.
Not because of what I was taught in school.
I knew because of the way we were.
Right, perfect. That's how we are supposed to learn about it. And it seems to me like the 1619 project that this is something that we need to be thinking about as part of how we think about ourselves as Americans. So I was curious, for you, having done so much research on this, what lessons do you think we can learn from that chapter of our history now?
Well, one big one, and this is coming up in the research for my next book, which is about the culture wars of the 80s and 90s, is like you have to fight. You have to fight. You can't compromise on this shit. You just can't. Once you start, it never goes away. Like once the studios started caving to Congress, it was over. You know what I mean? Now, I should say, it actually didn't last that long. I mean, lots of lives were ruined. I'm not trying to minimize it, right? But I do think like it was, the HUAC moment was this incredible trauma that thankfully didn't last that long because eventually McCarthy was disgraced and, all sorts of other things. But like, it didn't have to go that way. It could have kept going. You know what I mean? And so I do think you have to have the fight. Once people started compromising and giving in preemptively, I think, is it Rebecca Solnit who calls it don't surrender preemptively? I think that's one of her rules of living with authority. I think it's Rebecca Solnit. Anyway, but it's like you really see that with HUAC. You really see that immediately. The people who are like, once they hung the Hollywood 10 out to dry, it was really going to a weird place. Now, there's all sorts of different versions of fighting. I didn't talk about this much in the book, but one of the funniest things is, Stella Adler was called to testify. And she just was like, I'm just a dumb blonde. I don't know what I signed. I mean, she literally, it's like the greatest performance of her life. Stella Adler was a genius and did not suffer fools and was famously imperious and all this stuff. And she just got up to Congress. She's like, oh, gee, Senator, I don't know. And that was how she like escaped it, right? John Garfield tried to fight it. It's like you might not win, right? You might not win, but you might set someone else up too. And so like you have to fight. That's one of the big ones. And the other thing is that like living in a democracy means living with people whose ideas we don't like. Do you know? Like, I'm not a communist. I'm not. I hope that doesn't upset anyone. Like, I'm not a communist, right? One of the things that John Garfield, who was also not a communist, but his wife was, it was in an attempt to protect her that he got in so much trouble, or she had been at one time. One of the things he said is like, look, they should either make the Communist Party illegal or not. And if they're not going to make it illegal, then what is the problem, right? Like, if it's not against the law to do this, what are we talking about? And, you know, I keep thinking about that over and over and over again, that it has to be okay for people to believe different things and to argue about it and to fight about it. But once you get to the point of actually crushing people's ability to express themselves.
Or like firing people.
Or like firing people, yeah. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing in this moment right now, you know, particularly I until recently taught at the college level, but particularly at colleges, is a real attempt to crack down on speech that supports the rights and dignity of the Palestinian people. And it's a very scary moment that if you've read about McCarthyism, just feels completely, you're like, oh, this is not a one-to-one analogy, but this isn't that different. You know, it's like you're starting to blacklist people, you're starting to fire people, people are losing, you know, their jobs, and student organizations are being forcibly disbanded and stuff like that. And like for calling for a ceasefire, which just seems not that, you know, anyway. And so I just feel like, you know, these things are going to keep coming up, because one of the things that's happening right now in our society, and I talk about this a little bit at the end of the book, is there's all sorts of shared assumptions about how the world works, what good is, what bad is, you know, what politics is, and they're all breaking down. Actually, they broke down a while ago, and we're sort of living in the rubble of those assumptions. And so we're gonna keep having these really hot cultural flashpoints. What's going on in Israel right now is not the only one. There have been more, there will be more, and I think the more that we can look out for the rights of people even when we disagree with them, the more hopefully those rights will be protected when it's our turn in the witness box.
Yeah, that's a great thing to think about as we go into Thanksgiving.
Yes. Now that does not mean that you should argue with your parents about whatever. There's nothing to be won there.
No, don't worry.
Just be like, we've all got that one uncle.
Like in this same sort of vein of new ideas and what happens when new mores come in, I'm really curious about the change that happens in people's tastes. You talk about this, about the change in the taste of what was thought of as good acting, and whether, like, how does that happen? Like, how do we develop, like, in a chicken and the egg kind of way? Like, you know, there's like famous stories of like the rites of spring or whatever, but most of the time change is not like that. Change is not like people like holding their ears and screaming because they can't believe they're hearing new music, you know, like
dissonance, oh no.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, part of why I wrote this whole book was, frankly, I was like, how did that happen? Because, like, look, I love pre-method movies. I love studio system movies. We've talked a lot about what's the one with the Born Yesterday, right? Like, what's her name in Born Yesterday? She gets
Judy Holliday.
Julie Holliday,
famous Mensa member, Judy Holliday.
Right, but like, if you look at her in that movie or Cary Grant in anything or whatever, you're not being convinced by the performance.
You're not convinced by Judy Holliday.
I mean, I think
it's
an amazingly brilliant. No, you're not being convinced in a realistic, like...
She was a Mensa member.
I know.
She's playing one of the stupidest characters.
I know.
All right.
But you're seeing that's part of the fun of it, to me.
All right, Isaac.
So, or let's take a more consensus example. Let's look at Cary Grant.
I'm going to live with people whose opinions
I
disagree with.
Let's take Cary Grant in Bringing Up Baby, right? How many of you have seen Bringing Up Baby, the funniest movie ever made? Yes. Okay, great. Well, To Be or Not to Be gives it a run for its money. But all right. So in that movie, Cary Grant, famously one of the smoothest men alive, is playing an easily flustered paleontologist, right? And the way they do that is he hikes up his pants and he kind of stammers, right? And he has big glasses. He's like, oh, is that a leopard? Right? Like that's it. And so why is that happening? Why that's actually happening is that's what good acting was. And I actually think that's good acting. I think Cary Grant's a genius. I think Barbara Stanwyck's a genius. You know, I love that stuff. But the whole idea was that the studio would work with you to create a type. And once you were that type, you would play that type over and over and over and over and over again, because the industrial economics of the system required that. And so you know, Clark Gable made something like 17 movies in the first 2 years of his career, right? It's like, that's what they need you to be able to do. And so, and audiences knew it. They literally in the fan magazines are like, his type is this, right? And then when you go to see Cary Grant in Bringing Up Baby, you're like, how's Cary Grant gonna parlay his essential Cary Grantness into this nerdy schlemiel, right? That's what you're doing. And so that's the joy of seeing those movies. And then every now and then the actor gets to do the thing where they play against type, right? Like Jimmy Stewart in Vertigo or whatever it is. And those were the norms. Okay. Bring Up Baby, I forget what year it is. It's probably early 40s already, right? You fast forward 15 years, and now you've got a bunch of actors who are, you know, I'm so real. I'm just so real right now. I'm so real. You know, where there's a bunch of actors who are playing completely different people in every part. If you look at Montgomery Clift's filmography, you're like, what is this? Do you know what I mean? They're playing completely different people. They're trying to disappear into the role. They're trying to be super, you know, naturalistic. They've got all this torment. They're not speaking articulately.
And you
know.
can see the movies that sort of like straddle the like The Heiress, for instance.
Love The
right?
Heiress. Perfect example.
Where you have like half of them are doing one thing and half of them are doing another.
And then there's a bunch of great movies where that is sort of both, that becomes the subtext of the movie. My favorite one, since we talked about Jimmy Stewart, is Anatomy of a Murder, where it's like Jimmy Stewart is a fakey small town lawyer, and then like he's just surrounded by method actors and actor studio members, and it's all about how he uses his fakey small town lawyerness to defeat them, right? While they're being all super authentic and sincere because he's the one who actually knows the score. There's a lot of movies like that during that period. Red River, which I'm not a huge fan of, but like that's a good example. You've got John Wayne and
Face in the Crowd sort of reverses the
Face
thing
in
that
the
you're
Crowd.
talking about.
Totally. And so I'm really fascinated by that change. That change happened for a lot of reasons. One of them was the studio system broke up, right? That's a big one. There's an economic one. But another thing is that as we entered the 50s, and I try to talk about this with students a lot, you know, the 50s, there's a real conformity culture to the 50s. And to give you one example, if you read newspaper articles that cover the actor studio in the 1950s, they're like, can you believe it? The men wear jeans. Oh my God. And you're like, okay. But part of what's happening is in the midst of that great conformity pressure, an acting style that is constantly being like, actually, we're all repressed. What's actually going on is we're all repressing the essential parts of ourselves. And I'm going to kind of reveal that essential part of myself every now and then, you know? I think that holds a tremendous appeal for people. And then eventually it became all the famous people were method people, and it becomes the dominant, you know, by the end of the 70s, it's the dominant acting style.
Right.
You know?
Okay, so I'm going to ask 2 more questions, but they're going to pass out little cards to you. And if you have questions for Isaac, please write them down on these little cards, and then I will pick some and read them to him,
Amazing.
like a bedtime story.
And I will slowly fall asleep.
So I'm going to go on. I have so many more questions, and I can only like do 2 more. So why do you think theater artists are so tempted to make a guru of their teachers?
Why are theater artists so tempted to make a guru of your... I mean, I did that for sure.
And also, as an adjunct to that, how do you think that the old systems of power are still ingrained in our current system?
Totally. I mean, I think, you know, particularly when you're young, someone who's like, I know what the truth is, and I can tell you what the truth is, and you're going through this very unstable part of your life, like college, you know, and I can tell you what's right and wrong and what's true and false, and I can see in you what's true and false. I'm going to point it out. I'm going to tell you what you need to work on about yourself at this moment where you've just left your parents' house, you know. I think that's incredibly powerful and seductive, and sure, you know, when I've taught, I've been very, you know, resistant to being that person, right? It's like, I'm not going to give you an advice. I don't know shit. It's like, you know, it's just like, oh God. And I do think that there is that charge, that power, right? That frisson is part of the traditional acting student, acting teacher relationship within Stanislavski and post-Stanislavski stuff. Stanislavski did not want that. In fact, he sometimes would stop teaching for periods of time. Like, he did not want that. He would give these speeches of like, you think I'm this great guy, I'm a piece of shit just like you. Do you know what I mean? Like, he would do that a lot. But then if you read Acting the First 6 Lessons by Richard Boleslavsky, which is the first book in English that describes Stanislavski's technique, it's written as a play, and the cast of the play is the teacher, who is Richard Boleslavsky, very large, middle-aged man who ate 5 fried eggs for breakfast every morning, was 6'4", and the Russian man. And then the other character is the creature, a 16-year-old girl who wants to be an actress. And it is all about that power dynamic, right? And I think Stella Adler was really into that power dynamic. It's not just men, I think there's the idea that you, if you're in a position of power, can use that power for good. And it often doesn't actually work out that way, right? And we're hopefully a lot more conscious of it now. The thing that I do think that we have to find some other way to relate as acting teachers and acting students, and no one is quite sure what it is, right? Because what you actually want as an acting student is an authority figure who has an idea. They might not say this is the only idea, but they have an idea of a process that works, and they're going to teach that process. And that has sort of started to fall apart. And so some problematic stuff we've gotten rid of, which I think is good. But also, when I got to college, I was taught a survey of acting techniques. It was this week we're going to do Stanislavski, and tomorrow we're going to do rasa boxes or whatever. We're going to do Miser. Then we're going to do viewpoints. You're going to go like that against the wall, and it just that's not acting training. I would rather have. I didn't respond to the viewpoints, but I'd rather have a hardcore viewpoints person be for 12 weeks we're going to do viewpoints, because then at least I would have been taught something.
I was saying to Paul after finishing your book that I think that there's something really unfortunate about about the fact that you don't really know what kind of actor you are when you first start taking acting lessons. Because the thing that seems really clear to me is all of these teachers are valid if they help their student, and that different actors need very different things, or would respond positively, and it might be the thing that fits into them like a puzzle piece, be the thing that they're missing, or it might be the thing that they already have in spades, and then that helps unlock all the rest of the shit. And I guess I would just throw to you, how do you think a young actor could use, for instance, your book to start to figure out what might work for them?
Well, I definitely think, a young actor who might be, maybe Hanukkah is coming up, and you're thinking
Hanukkah,
about something to get for that young actor. You could get them 2 copies even, in case they just underline one so much they ruin it. My hope is that actors will try a bunch of stuff, see what appeals to them, and then pursue it, right? I mean, that's certainly what worked for me as a writer. That's what's always worked for me, is you just try a bunch of stuff, you take that thing seriously, and then, maybe some little piece of it you hold on to. My hope in terms of my book is there's a lot of information about how these acting methods work, and hopefully you'll find something in there that you respond to, and you're oh, I want to go do that, or whatever it is. It's worth saying, Lee Strasberg, Stella Adler, Sanford Meisner, all 3 of them were incredibly dogmatic about their techniques, right? Many of their students studied with 2 or all 3 of them, or would go study with Uta Hagen or whatever it was, right? It's a lot of people, after you get through that first generation, people understand that they actually need training, a lot of different kinds of training. And that's one of the things that eventually gives birth to Juilliard, is the idea that we can do serious training, but maybe an Israeli clown is teaching some of it, and maybe a Strasberg person's teaching some of it, and maybe a British voice person is, And so I hope that the other thing is that they will just learn the history of the ideas that they're learning. Because, one of the things that motivated the book was I was taught this stuff and I have no idea where it comes from or what it means,
Yeah. We have a really great first question from our audience. Is there another movement now as significant as method acting? And if not, would our current state of society allow one to develop given divisiveness and lack of consensus?
Yeah, I mean, I think my answer to that question is no, to both of those. No, there isn't, and no, there can't right now. Because you need some shared idea. I mean, there's all sorts of negatives that come from a society built on rigidly enforced consensus. I'm not being yes, let's go back to 1953. That was great. I don't believe that. But the idea that you have a dominant monolithic thing, and then you have a culture and a counterculture, that kind of clarity is very helpful when you want an idea to develop. If that kind of dialectic can be really useful for ideas. There's lots of people who have tried to kind of overthrow the Stanislavski consensus in the United States. And viewpoints is one we mentioned. Richard Schechner's kind of performance studies thing. There's been a bunch of them. None of them have become dominant. And I don't think that's necessarily because of weaknesses so much as just like we don't have the kind of culture where that can happen. Do you know what I mean?
Okay, so this is just, I think, a very good clarifying question, and I'm going to try to get through as many of these as possible.
Lightning round, let's do it.
So which actors and directors today use the method?
Oh, that's actually a difficult question because,
I know, but I think it's an important one.
It's an important one.
Let's rock it.
So lots of people who are older who studied with Lee Strasberg are still with us. They're towards the tail end of their careers, like Ellen Burstyn, Al Pacino, Jane Fonda. I'll just take those are three perfect examples, right? And lots of people studied with Meisner, Diane Keaton, for example. Stella Adler lived longer than either of them. Her last major student who became famous is Mark Ruffalo, who gives lots of credit to her and does events with Stella Adler at the studio and wrote the introduction to the book of her, And then there are people who now study at the Actor Studio program or come out of the Lee Strasberg Institute. They are often reluctant to call themselves method actors, but that is their training. The big example would be Bradley Cooper.
Right. I mean, I think also there's a the thing that I took away from reading your book, and it's also the thing I thought going into it, to be totally honest, is that basically every actor today is acting in the vein of the method.
I mean, one of the things that's really crazy is, the stylistic.
Right.
And the method, people tell you it's not a style, it's a technique. It can be used in a lot of different styles, but whatever. The stylistic sort of post-Brando template of what realistic acting looks like, even incredibly technically trained Brits are learning how to ape that style. So on that stylistic level, the post-Stanislavski American thing is completely dominant, right? And I do think the basic Adler ideas of how you break down a text into beats and you figure out what the character wants and all that stuff, that's the bedrock of all American acting training. That's inescapable. So there's certain things that are there all the time. Does everyone do like emotional recall exercises where they think about their cat dying to make them cry? No. But some people do. Bob Odenkirk does. I heard him talk about it in an interview.
Yeah, I love Bob Odenkirk.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you describe your experience doing archival research for this project and how to choose what to include, exclude? I'm going to just shape that a little bit and be like, let's just go to exclude. What I know that you cut 30,000 words from this.
Is that right? My editor's here. I think it was 30,000, and we added 10 new ones or something. Yeah. Ben was like, "This is too long."
Talk about those 30,000.
Ben, what did you make me cut? No. One of them was, I remember the note from Ben that there was like, there's too much description of performances of plays and plot summaries of plays in this. So that was one thing that went. A lot of theory went out the window because we wanted to keep the focus on the story. There was a lot of stuff, particularly about the next generation of acting teachers who trained with Stanislavski. So like now when I give talks at schools, I try to do like the DVD extras and do that stuff. There was a lot of stuff about Stella Adler's personal life because I just find her endlessly fascinating. She smuggled passports to Europe in the run-up to World War II so that Jews could flee, blank passports, when she went to Europe. She had affairs with everyone. And there's just so much gold there, I've read all of her correspondence with Harold Clurman, including the dirty ones. And, but that had to go. There's all sorts of, there's dozens of movies I watched that never get mentioned. Archival research, I spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress in Lee Strasberg's papers. I spent a lot of time at the Ransom Center in Stella Adler's papers. There's a bunch of other libraries I went to for other reasons. Boleslavsky's biographer taught in State College, Pennsylvania, and so I went there and I found these amazing interviews that had never been published anywhere that he did, and stuff like that. Archival research got a little hampered by the pandemic. And so I'm eternally grateful to the librarians who were still on the job, who I would write to and who would send me stuff. They would scan stuff and send it in. And I just there's all sorts of stuff that I couldn't have finished in the book without that. And then there turns out to be this treasure trove of Russian primary sources about theater in Russian online. And so I would download that stuff and then I would roughly translate it on Google and then I would send it to someone to translate and then I would get it back and things like that.
Amazing.
Yeah.
This is an acting question. How does an actor maintain themselves in terms of sanity when they portray an insane theatrical role for hundreds, if not more, performances on a stage? In other words, how do you wear the role and discard it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've talked to a lot of different actors who do that a lot in different ways. Do you have a ritual you do when a show closes? Like when you're done with a play, do you have a thing you do?
Not one thing.
Not one thing, right?
Yeah. I have a friend who's in their 80s who was a psychiatrist who worked with like emotionally disturbed patients, and I asked her once, and she said that she, to not take her work home with her, she would on the drive home put a patient mentally in a place along the road, like that one is by this mailbox, this one's here, this one's here, this one's here, and then she would get home and she wouldn't have any of her patients with her, and then she would on the drive to work pick them back up again.
I love
and that was very useful for me.
I mean, he talked about this on my podcast, so I don't think he would mind my saying this. You know, I interviewed Patrick Page about playing, because he played King Lear for like 4 months, and I was like, dude, do you carry parts with you? Like, you played King Lear, what do you do? And he's like, oh, well, I saw this healer and I had this psilocybin ritual and I said goodbye to King Lear. I mean, everyone has different ways of doing it. Lee Strasberg was very worried about his students doing this. One of the things he said about Al Pacino is that Al Pacino holds on to roles for too long, and that he was worried about him. You know, this was in the 70s, right after they did Godfather 2. And I think every actor, that's one of the things that actors have to learn how to do. That is one of the things that I could not learn how to do and why I quit acting in college, is that I was really unable to do that. I think that it's one of the places where technique and training can be most helpful. You know, there are actors who don't need training, or they pick up training, they pick it up on the job. But one of the things that I think that's the sort of thing that's, I think, really can be really useful, is to learn like what a ritual is or what you can do to let go.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. What's there to be said about the misappropriation of the method and the physical extremes actors go to in implementing this interpretation?
I have a lot to say about that in the book, which is for sale. No. More seriously, it's one of the things that I was trying to trace in the book is how did this incredibly internal system of acting become known for all of this external stuff of like, oh, I built a bark canoe and I lived in the woods in a yurt. And then I was playing an amputee, so I chopped off my left arm, or, you know, whatever it is. How did it become that? And it was actually a really fascinating thing to find out. I mean, the big answer is, the short version is, Lee Strasberg was very bad at explaining in public what the method was, and he didn't like doing it and didn't really want to do it, was bad at explaining it. He also really liked to claim people as his students and claim responsibility for them if he had worked with them. One of those people was Robert De Niro, and Robert De Niro is the one who pioneered this acting style, or this acting technique. And even though Robert De Niro didn't actually love working with Strasberg very much, you know, if you look at the back of Strasberg's posthumously published A Dream of Passion, the third word in it is Robert De Niro. So, you know, he claimed him. And so that sort of became synonymous with it. It is a very weird thing. You know, I try not to be too pedantic about it, but you would probably not be surprised how many times a week I'm like, that's not the method. That's not the method.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a kind of like strange thing that happens over and over again in the book, where the effect of something is the thing that is taken up rather than the thing that produces the effect.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Well, you can't see the technique. I mean, hopefully. The whole point of the technique is it's supposed to be invisible, right? So you can't see that. What you can see is the effect. And actors, I think, like to, any artist, you know, when I read a book, I'm looking for what can I imitate in it, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm sure actors are the same way when they see performances. They're like, oh, how did he do that thing?
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, so this is going to be our last question. What are some tells in performances of actors using method techniques versus other techniques, if any?
I do feel like by the time I got done with research in the book, I could watch a movie from the 70s and figure out who the actor had studied with and then Google it, and I was almost always right. So at least when it comes to 70s cinema, here are some tells. Lee Strasberg people, little withholding. A lot of subtext, a lot of eyes doing things, a lot of holding things in, and then maybe it explodes out. Ellen Burstyn, Al Pacino, again, perfect examples of this. A lot of withholding, a lot of interior, a lot of that, right? Sanford Meisner, pupils, I'll give you two examples, Robert Duvall, Diane Keaton. Always themselves, but more so, but in a way that makes sense for the role anyway, right? So Diane Keaton is always kind of, well, she's Diane Keaton, right? But it's like, it always works. It always works, right? Whether it's Reds or, you know, whatever, it always works. Adler people, it's a lot of doing things physically to let you know what's going on with the character. Warren Beatty, perfect example. Mark Ruffalo, Marlon Brando, Robert De Niro. There's a lot of physicalization of subtext. And there's often some attempt to transform themselves physically, although Beatty, of course, doesn't do that. But there's a lot of attempt to transform themselves physically. The outliers are people like Bobby Lewis and Uta Hagen. Where I get a little more lost. But, like by the end of it, I was like, I don't know, watching The Godfather or whatever, and I was like, James Caan, he's always kind of doing that James Caan thing. I bet James Caan was a Meisner guy. And I looked it up and I was like, got it in one. So you can often see that stuff that way, I think.
I just want to say I've read parts of Isaac's book many times. I've read through the whole thing once in a very thorough way, and it's so enjoyable. And like truly, I gave it to my parents. They read it cover to cover. Like it makes a great present. Christmas and Hanukkah are coming. Anyways, I thank you guys all for coming. Thank you, Isaac.
Absolutely.
I hope you guys all read and enjoy the book.
And thank you all so much for coming. Really quick, I will be signing books out there, so come say hi, get a book signed. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank
This
you.
means so much to me. Thank you.